Şimdi kısaca özetlemek gerekirse Türkiye ile ilgili olan kısmını bu Total Factor Productivity'nin ne kadar önemli olduğunu görüyorsunuz. 1990'larda büyüyebilirsiniz siz. Büyüme var, bir de şişme var. Şişme ile büyüme aynı şey gibi gözükebilir ama değil. 1990'larda Total Factor Productivity yok Türkiye'de. Sonra 2002-2007 yılları arasında var Türkiye'de. Sonra yine yok Türkiye'de. Demek ki çalışıyoruz ama verimli çalışmıyoruz. Verimliliğin arttırılması en önemli konulardan biri. Buradan bunu anlıyoruz. Şimdi Steve Hanke'yi size tanıtmak istiyorum. Steve, John Hopkins Üniversitesi'nden Applied Economics profesörü. Kendisinin özellikle para politikası ile ilgili son derece orijinal fikirleri var. Daha önce Bulgaristan'da para politikası ile ilgili çalışmalar yapmış. Para politikası niye önemli? Size şöyle söyleyeyim ki bugünkü panelde soruların bir kısmı oradan gelecek Türkiye etkileri üzerine. Dünyanın çivisi çıktı. Merkez bankalarının da çivisi çıktı. Çivi çoktan çıktı da tahta da darıldı. Amerika Birleşik Devletleri Merkez Bankası'nın bilançosu 8,9 trilyon dolara geldi. İnanılacak gibi değil. Tuvalet kağıdı gibi para basılmaya başlandı dünyada. Bunu sadece Amerika yapmıyor. Amerika yapıyor, ondan sonra diğer ülkeler de onu taklit ediyorlar. Dolayısıyla zor bir durum. Ve Steve bu konuda diyor ki, bu tipteki bir para politikası ciddi problemler yaratır. Zaten o problemlerin içindeyiz. Kendisinin buna dair bazı çözüm önerileri var. Şimdi ben stage'e Steve Hanke'yi davet ediyorum efendim.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, pleasure to be here in Istanbul, probably the second best city in the world. Paris, of course, is one, but Istanbul's pretty close. Mrs. Hanke's a Parisian, so I have a certain perspective, but it's great to be here. Mr. Aaron, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be at the Tax Auditors Foundation meeting. I am a little bit challenged. I'm following certainly the most famous Turkish economist in the world today, and also someone who delivered his speech in Turkish. I'm handicapped by being limited to English, but bear with me. I'll try to make things as clear as I possibly can. I do have one thing going for me, and that is the topic I'll be discussing is inflation. And I think perhaps some of you might be interested in the topic. I think it's appropriate to start by quoting a famous economist, John Hicks, Sir John Hicks, Nobel laureate, particularly amongst auditors and business people. And Hicks said, and I believe and advocate, there's nothing more important than a balance sheet. And when it comes to inflation, you have to pay attention to the balance sheets particularly of central banks and the commercial banking system. And to look at the economy and look at inflation, you have to have a model for what we call national income determination. And national income determination, the nominal national income is, of course, has two components to it, a real growth component and an inflation component. You add them together and you get a nominal number, a nominal GDP, for example. And the accounting identity that's important to understand using a monetarist model, the quantity theory of money, and the equation of exchange is what I'll be talking about today. That's the most accurate and reliable means to look at the determination of nominal GDP and inflation. And we go back to an accounting identity. And the accounting identity is MV, that's money times velocity of circulation of money, equals PY, the price level times Y, the real economic growth. MV equals PY. That's the equation of exchange. It's an accounting identity. MV is spending, and PY are the receipts that you get. So it is a simple identity, but it's a very useful identity. And I looked recently at 147 countries to see how the equation of exchange held up. And the reason I did that is because Darian pointed out he had a photo of Milton Friedman on one of his slides, and Milton Friedman was a monetarist. He embraced the quantity theory of money as the model for looking at income determination. And Friedman said that inflation was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. He also said, and I'm quoting, "I know of no exception to the proposition that there is a one-to-one relation between substantial rises in prices and substantial rises in the stock of money." So I looked at these 147 countries recently, and I took 1990 as a starting point for the data and 2021 as the ending point for the data. And I looked at changes in the money supply and changes in the price level to test Friedman's one-to-one relationship. Remember, he said you get a 10% change in the money supply, and you're going to get a 10% change in the price level. So that's the linkage here in this quantity theory of money. And what did I find? The correlation was 0.94. That's almost one-to-one. So there is a tight linkage between changes in the money supply and changes in the price level. And if you go back to that equation of exchange, MV equals PY, what this means is that the velocity, V is pretty constant, and Y is pretty constant. Real economic growth is fairly stable, velocity is fairly stable, and the unstable parts of the equation of exchange is money supply and prices, M and P. So let me see if I can run this. We're going forward, or are we going? Here we go. Technology, Darren. It's tough. So we have this linkage between the money supply and prices ultimately. And the real trick to understand and use the quantity theory of money is you have to look at the transmission mechanism. And if we have a substantial change in monetary growth, with a lag of 1 to 9 months, we get changes in asset prices. So if you see the quantity of money changing rapidly, you want to be jumping into the stock market, and you want to be long, sensitive commodity prices because they'll change very rapidly. Actually, with that lag, it's pretty short, 1 to 9 months. So you've got a good window there to make your decisions and investments. Then, with a lag typically of 6 to 18 months, economic activity, that's the GDP, the real GDP starts cranking up. And then, with a fairly long lag, ultimately, you're going to get inflation. That's a 12 to 24 month lag. Now, people get confused about money and prices because they look at what's happening in the money supply today, and they don't realize that there's these huge lags in the transmission mechanism before you ultimately get to inflation. And that's the topic of the day, inflation. So let's look. I won't go through the arithmetic, but if you look at the United States and what's happened recently, here's the money supply, the blue line. See the blue line? And we have here, this is COVID, and the money supply absolutely exploded when COVID hit. Remember, President Trump was the president then. The money supply shot up, the government deficit shot way up, and about 90% of that deficit was monetized by the central bank. And that's why we had this huge increase in the money supply, peaking in February of 2021 at almost 27% year over year. Now that's the highest rate we've had in the post-World War II era. It's a huge increase. And then subsequently, with the lag, remember the transmission mechanism, 12 to 24 months, of course, we started getting a tremendous amount of inflation in the United States. And the inflation rate, I will talk about in just 1 minute, but before I do that, notice the decline we have. And we're down now. We have a contraction, actually, in the money supply. It's contracting on a year-over-year basis at, a little over 4.5%. Now, we haven't had that in the United States since 1948, and then you have to jump back to 1936 to get another negative. So, unprecedented, huge explosion in the money supply, and then a huge contraction in the money supply in the United States. Now, the red line is an interesting line because if you rearrange the equation of exchange, MV equals PY, and you solve for what I call the golden growth rate, which is the growth rate in the money supply that's consistent with hitting the inflation target in the United States. The P is 2%. That's the inflation target. So if we solve that, you end up with a golden growth rate of about 6%, just a little over 6%. So you can see, if you want to hit the inflation target, you'd have to have the money supply fluctuating around that red line, roughly, and that's not what we're seeing now. Unprecedented. Explosion, a lot of inflation, and now huge contraction. Now, the reason that the quantity theory works, again, if you know how to use it, which I think I understand how to use it, and it's worked. John Greenwood and I wrote an article in the February issue of the Wall Street Journal, and we said that given the explosion in the money supply we're looking at the equation of exchange, we said the inflation would go up to about 6%, maybe as high as 9%. And in fact, in June of 2022, the inflation rate did go up to 9.1%. So we hit the bullseye using the quantity theory of money. Now, that was the explosion. We got that right. Now the question is, well, what's going to happen now? With this huge reversal and slamming on the brakes at the Federal Reserve, we estimate that by the end of this year, the inflation rate will drop to 2 to 5%. And I think it now is 4.9% in the United States. It's come down quite a bit. I think the inflation story is essentially over in the United States because of this huge contraction in the money supply. It's all about the money supply. We also, of course, have a problem because with the contraction in the money supply, I anticipate that not only an inflation story is over, but we'll have a recession in the United States, which isn't a good thing for Turkey, obviously. Now, let's talk about exactly what happened in the narrative and what you've been reading about, because you probably haven't been reading about what I've been talking about, because the narrative is something that's been put out mainly by the Federal Reserve. And once inflation starts, central banks don't like to take the blame for causing the problem because people don't like inflation. So they put up a big smoke screen always. And there's some other cause of inflation, but not us. We didn't do it. Not, as they say, not me, it's the guy behind the tree who did it. And sure enough, we had 785 economists in the Federal Reserve System. None of them are using the quantity theory of money. None of them are looking at the money supply. None of them forecasted inflation, by the way. This huge increase in the money supply, they're not looking at the money supply. They didn't forecast inflation. And in fact, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has said repeatedly that the Fed does not look at the money supply. They're not paying any attention to the quantity theory of money, for example. Powell, I'm quoting now just a few times, he said, "We now understand better how little we understand about inflation." So they first say they don't understand inflation. Secondly, Powell has said in congressional testimony, changes in monetary aggregates have not had a consistent, reliable relationship. They haven't been a good predictor of economic activity or inflation. In other words, you can forget the transmission mechanism that I had up on that first diagram. They're not looking at that. He also said monetary aggregates don't play an important role in our formulation of policy, and we don't think they are generally a good way to think about policy and inflation. That's interesting because, as I say, they had 785 economists in the Fed system, and they never could predict what was the disaster that was going to occur as a result of the huge explosion in the money supply that we've had. But this is a little bit the smokescreen aspect of things. So how did they explain inflation? And what have you been reading about in the papers? You've been reading that we had a lot of what I call ad hoc, non-monetary causes of inflation. Remember the supply chain problems we had? Remember the oil price increases that we had? Remember the war in Ukraine? And on and on and on. There's always some non-monetary explanation that comes from the Fed and is funneled through the journalists and the press, and of course that's what the public receives. Many non-monetary ad hoc reasons. These changes in prices for oil, for example, that isn't inflation. That's not the cause of inflation. That's a change in the relative price of oil compared to other things. Inflation is a basket with many things in it, over 300 in the United States, and the basket goes up and down. And in the basket, you've got oil prices and food prices and used car prices. They're all moving around, relative price changes. But the level of that basket is determined by the equation of exchange. MV equals PY. If the money supply goes up dramatically, with a lag of 12 to 24 months, you're going to get your inflation and the basket will go up. Now, the best way to think about this, I think, is to go back to the 1970s, these relative price changes, and look at Japan, because we had in 1973, you remember the OPEC oil embargo or cutback, and prices of oil shot up all over the world, including Japan. And the Bank of Japan at that time decided, oh, we have to accommodate this increase in the price of oil, and we'll do that by increasing the money supply. So they increased the money supply, and sure enough, oil prices, the relative price of oil went up in 1973 in Japan, but the Japanese inflation went up too. Then we had the second oil embargo in 1979, and the Bank of Japan wised up and they said, we're not going to accommodate this. This is a relative price change and the price of oil compared to everything else. We're not going to expand the money supply. They didn't, and they didn't have inflation in the second one. So the Japanese example is very clear and easy to understand, I think, in terms of differentiating between relative price changes and changes in the overall price index that we normally term inflation. Besides the smokescreen aspect of the Federal Reserve, we do have some other reasons why they look not at the money supply, but at these ad hoc factors. And I think one of the big reasons is that the models that they use at the Fed and most central banks are called post-Keynesian economic models. They're a different model than the quantity theory of money. They're a different model. They don't include money. Money is not included in those post-Keynesian models. So that's another reason why they don't look at the money supply and why they came up with a lot of ad hoc reasons, non-monetary reasons for the inflation. The other interesting thing, and this comes back to Darren's slide that had Milton Friedman's picture on it, and that is that Democrats dominate the staff of the Federal Reserve versus Republicans. Now, the Democrats, enemy number one for Democrats is usually Milton Friedman and the quantity theory of money. Democrats outnumber Republicans on the staff of the Federal Reserve by 48.5 to 1. So the dominant staffing is by Democrats, and there is therefore a political component as well as an economic modeling component, as well as the general smokescreen aspect that comes into play. And that's why the narrative has been so distorted and why people don't really understand what's been going on. Now, let me mention something else that's very important, and that before I get into Turkey, and that is that inflation, many people think this is some kind of a global problem. And inflation is not a global problem. Inflation is always and everywhere a local problem, unless you have a fixed exchange rate. For example, Hong Kong has a fixed exchange rate with the US, and the inflation and interest rates are very similar and move in the same way in Hong Kong as they do in the United States. But for most countries that don't have fixed exchange rates, inflation is local. And so we have inflation. Let me just go down the list here of where we are. United States, inflation currently 4.9% per year. Canada, 4.4% per year. China, 0.1%. There's almost no inflation in China because what do? They follow Milton Friedman and the quantity theory of money. They watch the money supply. They don't let it explode. The Eurozone, now the new inflation number just came out yesterday, 6.1%, so it has come down. Japan, 3.5%. Switzerland, 2.6%. United Kingdom, 8.7%. India, 4.7%. So you get inflation all over the place. It's not a global phenomenon. And if you think about the quantity theory of money, MV equals PY, it's pretty clear why it's not global. It's not a global thing. Now, we do have it in the United States, those numbers. We do have it in the United Kingdom, and we do have it in Europe, but they all follow the Federal Reserve. the Bank of England and the European Central Bank essentially do what they do in Washington, D.C. They copy it. So they copy it, and the smoke screen is the same, by the way. The narrative that they give is the same. Inflation is caused by supply chains. Inflation is caused by the war in Ukraine. Grain prices, used car prices, you name it. Now, let me jump quickly into what is really, I think, of most interest to you, and that is Turkey. That's the money supply, M3, broadly measured. That's the amount of money that's in the hands of the non-bank public in Turkey. So you can see going. Now, this is the blue line, the one wiggling around here. That's the money supply. If you look at the light yellow line, that is the golden growth rate. That is a growth rate in, again, we're solving for M after rearranging the quantity theory of money, MV equals PY, solving for M. And what is the golden growth rate consistent with hitting a 5% inflation target in Turkey? The US, remember, we have a 2% inflation target. Turkey has a 5%. So the golden growth rate in Turkey is a little over 12%. And look at the growth rate in M3 as of April. You're 60.5%, about 5 times faster than the golden growth rate. So why do you have inflation way above the target? And there's the target, the blue line. Why have you had this endemic inflation in Turkey? Because the money supply has been growing much faster than the golden growth rate. It's a pretty simple story, actually. Now, how do you solve the problem in Turkey? And this has been going on for a long time. Another reason I like Turkey is that, I don't know if you indicated, Oscar, in my bio sketch, but I'm a trader and I like to trade currencies. And I've never lost $1 trading the Turkish lira. Starting in 1994, I've hit every single time. It's the easiest thing to predict if you're a foreign exchange trader. And the solution, I remember my good friend, the late Ghazi Ersel, when he was the head of the central bank, and around 2000, 2001, when the crisis was developing, Ghazi and I were talking about the solution a lot, and Ghazi understood the solution. The solution is what I call a currency board system, and I noticed that Oscar did mention that I spent some time in Bulgaria in 1997, and in Bulgaria in 1997 I was President Stoyanov's chief advisor, and they had a hyperinflation. Now Turkey's never had a hyperinflation. There have only been 65 hyperinflations in world history, and believe it or not, Turkey has never hit hyperinflation. That is when the inflation rate's over 50% per month and lasts for 30 consecutive days. But in Bulgaria, in February of 1997, the monthly inflation rate was 242% per month. So it was hyperinflating. So Stoyanov said, well, what should we do? And I said, well, you've got to put in a currency board. And what is a currency board? A currency board is a monetary mechanism or monetary authority that issues a local currency. That local currency trades at a fixed exchange rate with an anchor currency, and it's a credible exchange rate, that fixed exchange rate, because the local currency must be backed by foreign currency, anchor currency reserves equal to 100%. So that's the kind of system they have in Hong Kong, for example. The Hong Kong dollar trades freely at a fixed exchange rate, 7.8 Hong Kong for 1 US, and the Hong Kong dollar is backed 100% with US dollar reserves. So the Hong Kong dollar, it's a clone of the US dollar. It's the same thing. If you don't like your Hong Kong dollar, you exchange it for US dollars. It's always credible and trustworthy because you know the monetary authority, the currency board, is going to have 100% reserves, and they'll be able to give you reserve currency, US dollar. Now, in Bulgaria, we started the lev, traded at a fixed exchange rate, was backed 100% with Deutschmark, and was credible. And what were the results? Well, I said the inflation rate was 242% a month. That got crushed immediately. Within 30 days, the inflation rate was down to single digits per year. Banks were insolvent in Bulgaria in 1997. The country had just defaulted on its debt. Banks within a year were solvent. The interest rates, and President Erdogan would love this, the interest rates went down to 2.4%. By the way, President Erdogan has the thing all upside down, the whole economic logic. Interest rates don't lead inflation. Interest rates follow inflation. So if inflation's going up, eventually the interest rate will go up in the market unless there's some kind of controls on it. So what about foreign exchange reserves in Bulgaria? After 12 months, the foreign exchange reserves tripled because there was a huge, always when you put in a currency board, there's a huge arbitrage opportunity because the interest rates in the domestic currency start out up higher than the anchor, and you have a risk-free arbitrage. You borrow in the anchor as much as you possibly can, and you buy local currency and get the interest rate differential. So it's totally a risk-free investment. Now, what about Bulgaria? Well, they've had the currency board 26 years, and they have the second lowest debt to GDP ratio in the EU. It's about 20%. The lowest one is Estonia, where I also put in a currency board in 1992. Did the same thing in Lithuania in 94, Bosnia, Herzegovina in 97. There have been about 70 of these currency boards historically, and none have ever failed. And I've advocated that that's what they should be doing in Turkey. And I actually did write a book in English that was translated and is available in Turkish that lays the whole thing out. But it would be a great thing for Turkey to smash inflation within 30 days, lower interest rates immediately, very easy to do. You can go over to Sofia and ask them at the central bank if you have any questions. They know exactly how to operate these things. They're very simple. So with that, I will, Oscar, give you the floor.
Thank you.